It's that time again. Time to enter the amazing world of the supernatural. And tonight, I want to tell you a rather strange story about, I suppose you'd call it a ghost, which haunted a perfectly ordinary house somewhere in our region. It's quite bizarre, but nevertheless absolutely true for all that. It all began some 4 years ago for a family of 4 people, mother, father and 2 daughters. They lived in a nice 4-bedroomed house in a pleasant suburb of a large city. The house was built in the mid-60s as part of quite a small select estate. Before then, the land had been part of the grounds owned by the church, which had included at one time an old church building long since derelict and deconsecrated. Attached to the church had been a graveyard, but that had not been used for burials since the late 18th century. Naturally, when the church was deconsecrated, the graves had been moved, with the descendants' permission, of course, to another churchyard. Anyway, the family were the 3rd to occupy the house. Before then, it had been owned by another family, and then by an old couple who had moved out in 1971. It was a happy house. There was never any indication of anything strange or odd about it. Not until 4 years ago, that is. Because then, something happened which, although seemingly insignificant to start with, came to represent a continuing horror, which was eventually to force the family out, never to return. The first manifestation of things to come happened one summer's evening. The family was sitting outside on the patio taking in the last of the day's sunshine when they heard the doorbell ring. The father got up and went to the front door. But when he opened it, there was nobody there. Cursing the local kids for playing childish games, he returned to his family and they continued to talk and enjoy their own company. About 10 minutes later, the bell rang again, and again, and the father went to answer it. There was nobody there. This was annoying, but no more than you would expect. By now it was getting quite dark, so the family went inside and settled down in the sitting room to watch a bit of television. They'd hardly got themselves comfortable when there was a violent knocking at the front door. The father jumped up and rushed to the door, as you'd expect, in quite a temper. A joke's a joke, but this was becoming silly. He flung open the front door, but there was no one there. He stepped outside and looked around, but still he could see no one. After he'd walked all round the house and ascertained that there was no one about, he came back in and stormed into where the family was sitting. For the next few minutes, the conversation was about how stupid people could be, and then the subject was dropped. At around 11:30, the family retired to bed. But any hopes of a peaceful night's sleep were dashed at 2 o'clock when they were awoken by an enormous banging noise. It seemed to come from downstairs near the front door. The father leapt out of bed, and as their bedroom was at the front of the house, he looked out of the window to see if he could see anybody. But although the porch light was on, he couldn't see anybody. The front was empty. He jammed on his dressing gown and rushed downstairs. But as he went towards the front door, he realized that the noise was coming from the dining room. So thrusting open the door, he switched on the light and prepared himself to confront the perpetrator of this disturbance. But there was no one there. However, the room wasn't empty. And the man certainly wasn't prepared for what he saw. For although I said there was no one there was no one human there. Because standing in the middle of the room, beating an infernal tattoo on the dining table, was a figure of, well, he didn't know how to describe it really. It was like a small man of about 5 feet in height, with long, stocky legs and a short, hairy body. He didn't appear to be wearing any clothes. Its arms were too long for its body. They seemed to reach down to near his ankles. And the head was definitely out of all proportion to the rest of it. It had a large, sloping forehead, with 2 gleaming red eyes set on either side of the big, flat nose. And under these was what I suppose you would call a mouth, only it was more like a bloody gap filled with vicious-looking fangs. The nearest description the man could apply was of a deformed monkey. The thing looked towards the man standing in the doorway and stopped banging the table. For a moment, it was a Mexican standoff. Neither moved. They just stared at each other. The man was speechless with terror, and the creature seemed to emanate evil from its very being. Then suddenly, the creature seemed to leap towards the man, who put his hands up in a defensive gesture. Just as it looked as if it would be savaged by this thing, it disappeared. The man was stunned and bewildered. He gingerly lowered his arms, and when he saw the room was empty, he turned to look into the hall, although how anything could have got past him was impossible to believe, as he was completely blocking the doorway. But there was nothing there. By now, he'd been joined by his wife, who'd been alarmed when she'd heard the involuntary cry of fear her husband had uttered when he'd confronted the creature. Without taking the time to offer an explanation, the man told his wife to stay by him as they searched the house. But after a thorough tour of all the rooms, and a check that there was no window or door broken or open, they found nothing. It was then that he told his wife what he had seen. At first, she tried to rationalize it, but the man would have none of it. So, despite certain misgivings at being laughed at, they decided to call the police. About half an hour later, a young constable called to the house to take a statement and to search for any signs of a break-in. But naturally, there were none. He questioned the man at length, and even called into his office to see if there had been any reports of any creatures which might have escaped from a zoo or something, although this was a long shot, as there were no zoos in the area. In fact, the nearest one was over 100 miles away. The police were sympathetic, but the family could see that the policeman didn't really believe what he was being told. So when he'd finished taking the statements and conducting a search, he got up to take his leave. And at that point, his disbelief turned to another form of disbelief, one based on a strong doubt of his own sanity. For as he went to leave the sitting room where they'd been talking, he found his exit was blocked by this creature standing in the doorway. Under normal circumstances, the policeman would have suspected some trickery, but what convinced him that what he was seeing was not natural was the fact that the thing, although seemingly solid and real, nevertheless was transparent. He could see right through it. After a pause, the creature began to bang on the door, and even though the noise was tremendous, the door didn't move as you would expect. The creature's hands, paws would be a more accurate description, seemed to actually penetrate the solid wood of the door. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it disappeared right before their eyes. It didn't turn or move in any way. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. Fear now gripped the entire household, as well as the constable, who quickly made his excuses and left, saying he would return with higher authority. And sure enough, he did return an hour later with his sergeant. And to cut a long story short, the sergeant also saw the creature. Over the next few days, the family was subjected to interminable attention, from neighbours who were intrigued by the presence of so many police cars, from the press who somehow got to hear of the strange events and wanted an exclusive story, and from any number of cranks who were simply sensation-seeking under the guise of being mediums or psychics. Eventually, a friend of mine, the one who usually accompanies me on my investigations, was contacted, and as his reputation was above reproach, he was invited to see if he could get to the bottom of the mystery. Unfortunately, on this occasion, I couldn't go with him, but he told me afterwards what he had experienced, and I do not doubt him at all. It took over 6 months to get to the bottom of the mystery, and during this time, the family was subjected to an ever-increasing catalogue of terrors. The creature was joined by another of similar appearance. Things started to fly around the house in typical poltergeist fashion, and what was the last straw for the family was the actual walls of the house seemed to shake and tremble under the influence of an invisible force. Eventually, however, we seemed to get to the root of the problem. We found out that just before the church, which had originally stood on the land, had been abandoned, there had been reports of a satanic group practicing their rituals in the deserted graveyard and conjuring up all manner of fearful entities. It had been their activities which had compelled the church authorities to take the decision to move away. The family moved out of the house 2 years ago, and since then it has stood empty. No one wants to buy it, it seems, even though it is what you could call a desirable residence. But then again, who wants to buy a house which already has a permanent, undesirable occupant? Would you?